The dust had not yet settled from the stagecoach wheels when Ida Wells stepped down onto the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, a baby on her hip and fire burning so bright in her dark eyes that the men loitering outside the Silver Creek saloon straightened up without knowing quite why. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself as though she owned every inch of ground beneath her boots. Her dress was travel-worn, a deep burgundy that had faded at the shoulders from too many days under a relentless prairie sun, and the baby, a girl just past 8 months old, round-cheeked and solemn-faced, sat perched on Ida's left hip with a comfortable ease that spoke of weeks spent in exactly that position. The baby's name was Clara, and she regarded the world from her mother's hip with wide brown eyes that matched Ida's own, though Clara's were softer, still unacquainted with the particular hardness that life had pressed into her mother's gaze. Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was a cattle town at the height of its noise and ambition. The Kishome Trail still funneled longhorn cattle through its dusty streets by the tens of thousands each season, and the town had grown up fast around that commerce, too fast, in the way of things that grow without anyone tending them properly. There were 4 saloons, 2 hotels, a livery stable, a barber, a doctor, a land office, and 1 general store that sat at the corner of Main and Second like a solid and reliable old friend among a crowd of unreliable acquaintances. The store was owned by a man named Harlan Greaves, though it was managed day to day by his son-in-law, and it served the needs of every rancher, trail hand, homesteader, and traveler who passed through. Ida Wells was not passing through. That was the first and most important thing to understand about her. She had a letter in the pocket of her dress creased, and reread so many times the paper had softened at the folds, from her late husband's brother, Samuel Wells, who had written 8 months ago to tell her that a parcel of land outside Caldwell had come to her by virtue of her husband's will. 40 acres on the South Fork of Bluff Creek, with a standing structure, a well, and the legal deed already registered at the county seat. Come and claim it, Samuel had written, in the blunt way of men who do not understand what it costs a woman to uproot her life. I cannot hold it much longer. There are men who want it. Her husband, Thomas Wells, had been dead 11 months. He had died of a fever in St. Louis, swiftly and without warning, leaving Ida with a 3-month-old daughter, a rented room, $42, and the stubborn conviction that she would not spend her life being pitied by anyone. She had packed what she could carry, sold what she could not, and boarded the stage at St. Louis headed west, because the land was the only solid thing left in her name, and Ida Wells had never been the kind of woman to let a solid thing go. The stage had deposited her at the end of Main Street, and the driver had set her trunk on the boardwalk with a thud that sent Clara's head pivoting in mild alarm before she settled back against her mother's shoulder. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back up to the box with the indifference of a man who deposited people in strange towns for a living, and Ida stood in the afternoon heat and took stock of her situation. She needed to find the land office, file her presence with the county records, and get herself and Clara out of the July heat before the baby grew fussy. In that order. She had learned to think in lists since Thomas died. Lists kept the panic from flooding in around the edges. The general store was the closest building, and she had seen a sign in the window advertising dry goods, provisions, and postal services. She needed provisions. She shifted Clara higher on her hip, gripped the handle of her travel bag, and walked toward it. Gilbert Ford was coming out of Greaves' General Store at exactly the moment Ida Wells was coming in, and he nearly walked into her because he had a 50-pound sack of flour balanced on one shoulder and was watching his own footing on the wooden steps rather than the street. He was a large man, 6 feet and some change, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who have spent their adult lives doing physical work, and the flour sack made him look larger still. He wore a plain brown work shirt, denim trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. His hat was pushed back on his head the way it always was when he was thinking about something else, and he had a face that was weathered and honest, with dark eyes under straight brows and a jaw that had not been shaved since Tuesday. He caught the door on its swing with his free hand before it could close, looked up, and found himself looking directly at a woman with a baby on her hip and eyes that could have cut glass. He stepped aside. He held the door. It was an instinctive thing, the kind of courtesy his mother had pressed into him so thoroughly in childhood that it operated independent of conscious thought. But he noticed her. It would have been impossible not to notice her. And he noticed the way she paused for just a fraction of a second, as though she had been prepared to fight her way through the door if necessary and was momentarily recalibrating. "Much obliged," she said, and her voice was low and clear, the kind of voice that expected to be heard. "Ma'am," he said, because his mother had also pressed that into him. She walked past him into the store, and he stood on the step for a moment longer than he needed to before he shifted the flour sack and headed for his wagon. Inside the store, Ida set her travel bag on the floor beside the counter and moved Clara to her other hip to give her left arm a rest. The store smelled of coffee and sawdust and salt pork, and it was mercifully cool after the street. A boy of about 14 was sweeping the far end of the floor, and behind the counter, a thin man with round spectacles was tallying figures in a ledger. "Afternoon," Ida said. "I'm looking for provisions for the next 2 weeks: flour, salt, dried beans, and coffee. Also cornmeal if you have it. And I need to know where the land office is." The thin man, whose name was Mr. Aldous Greaves, nephew to Harlan Greaves and keeper of the store's accounts, looked up with the slightly startled expression of a man unaccustomed to women who stated their needs plainly and in full. "Land office is 2 buildings north," he said. "We have everything else you mentioned. You passing through?" "No," said Ida. "I'm settling. I have a claim on 40 acres south of the creek." Aldous Greaves set down his pencil and looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that suggested he was trying to do a calculation. "The old Wells property," he said. "It's not old," Ida said evenly. "My husband filed on it 2 years ago. His name was Thomas Wells. The deed is registered. Now if you could fill my order, I'd appreciate it. My daughter's going to need feeding before the day's much older." Something in her tone closed the subject, and Aldous Greaves reached for a brown paper sack without further comment. Outside, Gilbert Ford was loading his flour sack into the back of his wagon when his hired hand, a young man named Pete Dawes who was 22 and enthusiastic about most things, came trotting around from the side of the building where he'd been watering the horses. "Who was that woman?" Pete asked, because Pete noticed everything and had opinions about all of it. "Didn't catch a name," Gilbert said, and climbed up to the wagon seat. "She looked like trouble," Pete offered cheerfully. "Most women coming into Caldwell with a baby and a travel bag look like trouble," Gilbert said. "It usually means they're tougher than everything this town has to offer." He clicked his tongue at the horses and pulled the wagon out onto the street. But his dark eyes moved briefly to the window of Greaves' store as he passed, and he caught a glimpse of that deep burgundy dress and a baby's small round head, and he kept driving. Gilbert Ford was 31 years old and owned a cattle ranch called the Blue Creek Spread, named for the particular color of light on the water in the mornings, that sat on 320 acres 8 miles north of Caldwell. He ran a herd of 400 head, employed 4 full-time hands and additional seasonal ones, and had spent the better part of a decade building the place from a quarter section of raw grassland into something he could be genuinely proud of. He was not a man who spent much time in town. He came in for supplies, the occasional necessary business at the land office or the bank, and once in a while for a quiet drink and conversation at the more respectable of the 2 establishments that could be called a saloon without stretching the word too far. He was well regarded in Caldwell and the surrounding county, known as a fair employer, an honest dealer, and a man who did not go looking for trouble, which was the most practical kind of virtue in a cattle town. He had been engaged once, to a woman named Marjorie Hutchins, who had come west from Ohio with her family and had decided within 18 months that Kansas was not what she had hoped, and that Gilbert, though admirable in many respects, was not sufficient compensation for the grasshoppers and the wind. She had gone back to Ohio. That had been 4 years ago, and Gilbert had made his peace with it, or at least with the practical fact of it, which was that the ranch needed running, and self-pity was a luxury he couldn't afford. He drove home thinking about fence repairs and cattle counts. But somewhere under all that practical thought, the image of dark eyes and a squared-off chin persisted with an inconvenient stubbornness. Ida Wells found the land office, presented her deed and her letter, and spoke to a man named County Recorder Hawkins, who was either deeply officious or deeply nervous. She could not tell which, and who seemed surprised, though carefully not disapproving, that the claimant on the Wells property was a woman alone. She answered every question he had with patience and with facts, and she walked out with her presence formally recorded and a copy of the deed in her possession. And she stood on the boardwalk outside the land office and felt something in her chest ease very slightly, the way a knot will ease when you work at it long enough. Clara, who had been patient through the whole ordeal, chose this moment to make her displeasure with the current situation known in a voice that turned 2 heads across the street. "All right," Ida murmured. "All right, baby girl, I hear you." She found a room at the less expensive of the 2 hotels, a clean room with a narrow bed and a washstand, run by a Mrs. Florence Tate, who was a woman of 50 with sharp eyes and a practical heart. Mrs. Tate looked at the baby and at the travel bag, and at the way Ida paid in cash without hesitation, and she said, "Breakfast is at 7, and there's a pitcher of milk kept cold in the kitchen for anyone who needs it for a young one." "Thank you," Ida said, and she meant it more than 2 words could carry. That night she lay in the narrow bed with Clara asleep across her chest, and she thought about the land. She thought about the standing structure. She did not know yet whether it was a house or a shed or something between the 2 and the well, and the 40 acres of Kansas grassland that the summer sun would have baked to a dry gold by now, and she made her lists. What needed to be done in the first week, the first month? What she had in cash, less than $30 after the stage fare and the first week's room and the provisions, and what she could do with it. She was not trained as a farmer or a rancher, but she was not stupid, and she had learned from Thomas's letters about this land that it had good grass and decent water rights, and that men who knew cattle had expressed interest in grazing it. That was a thought worth turning over. She fell asleep with Clara warm against her and the prairie wind moving through the single window, and whatever dreams she had were private ones. The next morning she arranged with the livery stable, a man named Earl Hobbs, who was old and weathered and did not waste words, to hire a horse and a small wagon to drive out to the property. She loaded her trunk and her provisions into the wagon, settled Clara into a nest of blankets in the back, and drove south out of Caldwell along a packed earth road that ran beside Bluff Creek. The land revealed itself to her gradually, the way things do in Kansas. You don't come around a corner and see it whole. It opens up around you in slow increments, the grassland stretching wider and the sky getting bigger, until you feel that you are very small and also, strangely, very free. The creek ran to her left, lower in late July than it would be in spring, but running clear over flat stones in a way that made the sound of water the most welcome sound she had heard in weeks. She found the property marker, a cedar post with the numbers carved in, and turned the wagon off the road down a 2-track trail that pressed through the tall grass. The structure came into view after about a quarter mile, and her heart, which she had been keeping carefully steady, lifted in a way she had not quite been prepared for. It was small, 1 room, with a lean-to kitchen addition off the back built of rough-cut timber that had silvered in the sun. The roof was intact. The window shutters were closed. The well was 20 feet from the front door, and a crude barn or large shed stood about 40 yards north, open on the south side, with a dirt floor and a hitching rail. The grass around the buildings had grown tall and dry, but the structures themselves had integrity. They had been built by someone who intended them to last. Thomas had filed this land and built these structures in the year before Clara was born, before his own death had become a possibility in either of their minds. He had written to her from here with such excitement in his words. She had those letters still, about the sky and the grass, and the way the creek sounded in the morning. He had meant this to be a beginning. Ida stepped down from the wagon, lifted Clara to her hip, and walked to the door of the house. The latch was a simple iron one, and it opened cleanly. Inside was dim and smelled of dry timber and dust, but also of something that had once been inhabited and waiting to be again. There was a wooden bed frame, a table and 2 chairs, an iron stove that was solid and clean, shelves along one wall, a rag rug on the floor that had been carefully folded and left on the table as though someone had placed it there on purpose. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. "Well," she said softly to Clara, who was looking around with her wide brown eyes. "This is ours." She set Clara on the rag rug with a dried biscuit to keep her occupied, opened the window shutters to let the light and the prairie air in, and began to make it a home. She spent 3 days at the property cleaning, airing, and inventorying. On the 4th day she drove back into Caldwell for additional supplies, a water pail, a broom, oil for the lamp, and found herself at Greaves' General Store again in the early afternoon. Gilbert Ford was at the counter when she walked in. He was talking to Aldous Greaves about an order of fencing wire, one boot propped on the low rail that ran along the base of the counter, his hat in his hand for once, which gave her a better look at his face than she'd had before. He had the kind of face she had come to associate with men who worked outdoors in all weather, not pretty exactly, but deeply honest, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. He was somewhere around her age or a few years older, she judged. 30, perhaps 31. He noticed her the moment she came through the door. She saw it happen, a small shift in his attention, the way a man's focus moves when something catches it, though he finished his sentence to Aldous before turning. That struck her as considerate, the fact that he finished his sentence before turning. "Mrs. Wells," said Aldous, with the air of a man who has been thinking about something and is relieved to have the subject walk back in. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," Ida said. She shifted Clara to her other hip and consulted her list. Gilbert stepped back from the counter to give her room, which was courteous and also natural. He moved easily for a large man, without the kind of deliberate self-consciousness that some men fell into when they were trying to make an impression. "Ma'am," he said. And then, apparently deciding that "ma'am" twice in a week without more to it was insufficient, he said, "Gilbert Ford, I believe I held the door for you the other day." "I remember," she said. She looked at him directly, which was something she had learned to do because she had found it was one of the most efficient ways of determining what a man was made of. He held her gaze without flinching, and without looking anywhere other than her face, which was a point in his favor. "Ida Wells, and this is Clara." Clara regarded Gilbert Ford with her characteristic solemn assessment. Gilbert looked at the baby with an expression that was genuine and unperformed, the kind of look that meant he actually liked children rather than performing the socially appropriate appreciation of them. "Hello, Clara," he said. Clara stared at him for a long beat and then, as though she had reached a conclusion, patted her mother's shoulder with one small hand. "I understand you've taken the old Wells property," Gilbert said. He said "old" without thinking, and then she saw the flicker realize that might carry an unintended connotation for a widow and added, "The property south of the creek, I mean, down on the second bend." "My husband's land," she said, and there was no quaver in it. "I've filed my deed at the county seat in my presence with the recorder. It's my land now." "Yes, ma'am," he said. No argument, no flicker of skepticism. "Good water access down there. Good grass, too, for this end of the county." "So I've heard," she said. "I'm thinking about it." She placed her order with Aldous and paid for it, and she was aware throughout the process that Gilbert Ford was still nearby, Not hovering, not that kind of man, she suspected, but present in the way of someone who has not quite finished thinking something through. When she had paid and Aldous was wrapping her supplies, Gilbert said, from where he was leafing through a catalog on the side counter, "The stove in that place, the iron one. It'll need the flue pipe checked before you use it hard. There's sometimes a fitting that works loose over the winter." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I checked it." He looked up. There was something that might have been amusement in his expression, or might have been respect. She decided she did not particularly care which it was, though she noted that he had offered the information without condescension, which was not always the experience she had with men offering practical advice. "Good," he said. She gathered her supplies and left, and Gilbert Ford stood looking at the catalog he was not reading for a moment before he put it down and walked out into the afternoon sun. Over the following weeks, Ida established a routine. She was up before Clara, which in practice meant she was up before dawn, kindling the stove and heating water, and reviewing her finances with the kind of disciplined repetition that kept anxiety manageable. She was not well capitalized. That was the plain truth. She had enough to see through the summer if she was careful, and she could grow a kitchen garden in the creek bottomland for vegetables, and she had the provisions she'd laid in. But she could not run a ranch on 40 acres with no livestock and no labor and no knowledge of the cattle business. What she had was the grass and the water access. And in 1878 Caldwell, grass and water access were the two things that men with cattle needed most. She drove back to town in the second week of August and visited the offices of 3 cattle men, whose names she had gathered by the simple method of asking Mrs. Florence Tate at the hotel, who knew everything about everyone in Caldwell, and had no particular reason to withhold it from a woman she had taken a liking to. The first 2 cattle men received her with varying degrees of surprise and varying degrees of condescension. The third, a man named Elias Purcell, who ran a modest herd and was currently scrambling for grazing land because a neighboring operation had fenced off a section he had been using, received her with attention. They negotiated a grazing lease, her water access and her bottomland grass, his cattle and his labor to manage them, with a sum of money paid quarterly that would, if she managed carefully, allow her to maintain the property through the winter. She walked out of that meeting with a signed paper in her pocket and a feeling of solid ground underfoot, and she celebrated by buying Clara a small cloth doll from Greaves' store and sitting on the bench outside to let the afternoon sun fall on them both. It was there that Gilbert Ford found her on his way out of the store, his own order of wire and hardware loaded in the wagon behind her. "You look pleased," he said, which was an observation rather than an intrusion. "I've just signed a grazing lease," she said, "with Elias Purcell." He sat down on the bench beside her at the respectful distance of a man with good manners and set his hat on his knee. "Purcell's a fair man," he said. "He'll not trouble you." "I don't imagine he'll be in a position to trouble me," Ida said, with a particular dryness that made the corner of Gilbert's mouth move. "I negotiated his access terms carefully." "I imagine you did," he said. Clara, who was examining her new cloth doll with the focused intensity of a small scientist, looked up at Gilbert and offered the doll to him with an outstretched hand. It was, Ida thought, a considerable gesture of trust from a child who had spent the past month regarding the wider world with appropriate skepticism. Gilbert took the doll, examined it with appropriate seriousness, and handed it back. "Much obliged," he said to Clara, with the same gravity he had used with her mother. Something warm moved through Ida's chest. She did not examine it very closely. They talked for a while about the land, about the creek levels, about the coming autumn, which would be drier than the previous year according to the old ranchers who read the signs. Gilbert spoke about the ranch in the way of a man who has built something he is genuinely proud of, and has not yet quite figured out how to talk about it without seeming to brag, which meant he spoke about it carefully and in technical terms, the fence lines and the herd numbers and the well depth, and she listened and asked questions that surprised him with their practicality. When they parted, he to his wagon, she to the livery to retrieve her horse, he said, "If you have trouble with the property, Miss Wells, any kind of trouble, it would be worth letting someone know." He said it simply, without drama. "Mrs. Wells," she said, "I was married." She said it without grief and without challenge. It was simply a correction of fact. "Mrs. Wells," he said, and there was a kind of acknowledgment in his voice that she was not sure she had a name for. "I beg your pardon." "You're forgiven," she said, and drove away. She thought about him on the drive home. She thought about the steadiness of him, the way he moved and spoke without performance, the way he had looked at Clara, the way he had corrected himself without making a production of it. She thought about the feeling of warmth in her chest on the bench outside the store, and she turned it over the way she turned over practical problems, inspecting it from different angles. She had not come to Caldwell looking for a man. She had come looking for land and a future and ground to stand on. She had a daughter to raise and a property to run, and the kind of self-sufficiency that had been ground into her out of necessity. She was 27 years old, and she had buried a husband and crossed a state alone with a baby on her hip, and what she did not need was a complication. But she was also 27 years old and not yet made of stone, and Gilbert Ford had kind eyes and a steady hand and had held the door for her without a thought. She thought about it for a while, and then Clara started fussing, and she pulled her attention back to the immediate world. August moved toward September with the particular slowness of the Kansas summer's end, when the heat does not let go but begins to feel tired, and the grass goes from gold to amber, and the creek runs lower still. The Purcell cattle arrived on Ida's bottomland in the third week of August, 30 head, managed by a boy named Jack who came twice a week to move them and check the water, and who was respectful and unobtrusive. The quarterly payment cleared her through to November. She began to settle into the land. She had not expected to love it. She had expected to respect it and work it and live on it, which was enough. But love was what happened. The morning, specifically. The way the light came across the grass when it was still low and golden, and the creek sound and the birds and Clara's face when she was set in the grass in the morning light and turned her head to watch a meadowlark. These things happened to her daily, and she received them with a gratitude she had not been expecting. She also received Gilbert Ford with increasing frequency and in ways she had not been expecting. He came by the property for the first time in early September, ostensibly to ask about the creek levels, since his own property shared the creek about 5 miles upstream, and the water rights for the fall season were a matter of practical coordination among the adjacent landowners. He arrived on horseback, a big roan that suited him in the way that some horses suit some men, naturally and without effort. He called from the edge of the property before coming down the trail, which she appreciated, and he stayed on his horse until she came out to meet him, which she also appreciated. He was treating her property with respect. They talked about the creek for perhaps 15 minutes, and then talked about other things for perhaps an hour, standing in the afternoon light at the edge of the garden she had started in the bottomland, while Clara sat in the dirt at her mother's feet and systematically disassembled a pinecone. He told her about the ranch more than he had before, and with less careful suppression of pride. He had built the house himself, he said, over 2 winters with help from his hands. He described the lay of the land, the blue light on the water in the mornings that had given the place its name, the particular quality of the grass on the north section. She listened and thought about what it would look like and found that she wanted to see it. She did not say that, but she noted that she wanted it. He told her that he had been in Kansas 8 years, that he had come from Missouri at 23 with a half-broken horse and more confidence than sense, and that the land had cured him of the excess confidence without curing him of the love of it. He said it without self-deprecation and without self-importance, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was an unusually straightforward person. She told him about St. Louis. About Thomas carefully, without drama, because Thomas deserved accuracy and not performance, and she found that she trusted Gilbert's steadiness enough to be accurate with him. She told him that Thomas had been a good man who had died of a fever in a rooming house in October of last year, and that she had grieved him and would continue to grieve him in the particular private way of people who have been genuinely loved. She told him that Clara had Thomas's hands, which made her happy and sad in equal measure, every time she looked at them. Gilbert listened the way he did everything else steadily, without rushing ahead, without offering conclusions before she had finished. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He chose good land," and she understood that he meant it as a tribute to Thomas, and she received it as one. He came back the following week, and the week after that. The third time he came, he brought a bundle of carpenter's nails and a straight piece of hardwood. The lean-to kitchen at the back of her house had a cabinet door that had been hanging wrong since she arrived. She had mentioned it once, in passing, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, and he had remembered, and had come prepared to fix it without making the act of fixing it a performance of his own thoughtfulness. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him work, and Clara stood beside her with one hand gripping her mother's skirt, watching with her characteristic solemn focus. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He set the last nail and stood back to check the door's hang. It fell smooth and true. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her then, across the small, warm space of the kitchen, and there was something in his expression that she had been watching for without quite admitting that she was watching for it. Something that was not the careful social courtesy of a neighbor or the practical attention of a man who liked to fix things. Something that was simply and plainly about her. She held his gaze. Then Clara said something emphatic in the pre-language that constituted her primary mode of communication at this age, and the moment shifted, and Gilbert looked at Clara and smiled, and Ida looked at Gilbert smiling at her daughter, and the warmth in her chest that had been there since the bench outside the store spread into something she could no longer pretend not to notice. October came in with cooler air and the smell of approaching change. The cattle on the bottomland were moved by Purcell's operation to their winter range, and the quarterly payment came through as agreed, and Ida had her accounts in order. She had also, over the previous weeks, done something that surprised even herself. She had begun to write. Not letters, she had no one to write letters to, with Thomas gone and her family, a complicated story she had largely been estranged from since she left home at 19, but notes about the land. Observations about the grass and the water and the weather, the kinds of practical records that a landowner needed, and that she had found she was drawn to in a way that was more than practical. There was something in the act of recording, of setting language to the real world around her, that quieted the part of her mind that still hadn't fully believed this was real and permanent and hers. On a cool Tuesday in October, she drove into Caldwell for her fortnightly provisions run and found the town in an agitated state. There had been a dispute at one of the saloons the previous evening, the sort of dispute that cattle towns produced with the regularity of the tides, and it had spilled onto Main Street and ended with broken glass, and a man with a dislocated shoulder, and a general residue of bad feeling hanging over the morning like the smell after a rain. She went to Greaves' store and did her shopping and was loading her wagon when she heard a raised voice from down the street, in front of the land office, and turned to see a man she did not recognize, broad and loud, and possessing the particular air of someone who expected deference and was not receiving it, standing in front of a smaller, older man she did recognize. The smaller man was County Recorder Hawkins, and he was holding a sheaf of papers at his chest and looking pale. The loud man was saying that the Wells property deed was not properly registered. He was saying this in the manner of a man who has made the same assertion several times and is increasing volume in lieu of finding new arguments. He said he had an interest in that acreage, and that there were questions about the original filing. He said all of this very loudly, and with a great deal of forward motion that was not quite threatening, but was absolutely intended to intimidate. Ida set down the flour sack she was holding, adjusted Clara on her hip, and walked to the land office. "May I ask who you are," she said, "and what interest you claim in my property?" The loud man turned. He was perhaps 50, well-fed in the way of men who have spent their prosperity on themselves, with a wide mustache and the eyes of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted by making the getting of it uncomfortable for everyone else. His name, she would later learn, was Denton Cross, and he ran a cattle operation north of town and had been eyeing the creek bottom land on the South Fork for 2 years. "Your property," he said. "My property," she said. "Ida Wells. My husband Thomas Wells filed the original claim and I hold the deed. I have it with me, if you'd like to see it." She did have it with her. She had carried it with her everywhere since arriving, because she had learned in the first hours of being a woman alone with a deed that the physical presence of documentation was more effective than any amount of verbal assertion. She pulled it from her coat pocket and held it out. Cross looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at Clara, who looked back at him with the steady, unflinching gaze of an 8-month-old who has no particular opinions about his social standing. Something shifted in Cross's expression, not shame exactly, but a recalibration of approach. "The question," he said more quietly, "is about the water rights on the South Fork." "The water rights are registered with the deed," she said. "Mr. Hawkins can confirm it." She looked at Hawkins, who confirmed it somewhat tremulously. Cross looked at her for a moment longer, and then he stepped back, and the confrontation deflated like a punctured bladder, and he walked away with the particular deliberateness of a man who is pretending this was his idea. Recorder Hawkins said, "Mrs. Wells, I should warn you Cross has made inquiries about that land before. He won't stop inquiring." "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Neither will I." She drove home with her provisions and her daughter and a new item on her list. Look into the legal standing of water rights claims on the South Fork. She had heard something once about a lawyer in Wichita who had won a case for a widow on exactly these questions. She would write him a letter. She was still thinking about it when she saw Gilbert Ford's roan horse tied at her hitching rail. He was standing at the corner of her little barn, examining the repair she had made to the south wall where a board had come loose, and he turned when he heard the wagon. "I heard there was a scene in town," he said, when she had pulled up and he had come to take the lead rope from her. "Word travels," she said. "Caldwell is not a large place." He helped her down from the wagon, took her hand for the step, and it was the first time he had touched her hand, and she was aware of it in a way that she was aware of most things, precisely and without fuss. His hand was large and warm and slightly rough from work, and he let go of it when she was on the ground. "Cross has been interested in this land for a while." "I know," she said. She lifted Clara down and set her on the ground. "I'm writing to a lawyer in Wichita." He nodded, not surprised she noticed. Not moved to say he could handle it for her, or that he knew a man, or any of the dozen variations on that theme that she had been bracing for. He nodded and said, "There's a precedent in the county for defending water rights by way of the original filing date. You'd want to argue that." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I argued it myself 4 years ago," he said. "Different situation, it was about the creek on the north section of my spread, but the principle holds." He was quiet for a moment. "I could write down what I know of it. It might be useful to the lawyer." She looked at him in the afternoon light, with the grass going gold around them and the creek audible in the near distance, and felt something shift in the careful, self-sufficient architecture she had been building since Thomas died. Not a collapse, nothing so dramatic as that. More like a door opening in a wall she had not known was there. "I'd appreciate that," she said. He wrote it down that evening, sitting at her table. She had offered coffee and he had accepted. And Clara fell asleep in the armchair by the stove with her cloth doll tucked under her chin, and the lamp threw a warm circle over the paper and the coffee cups and the two of them sitting across from each other. And Ida thought that this was the most domestic and the most quietly happy she had felt in a long time, and she let herself feel it without apology. He finished writing, folded the paper and slid it across the table to her. She picked it up. Their fingers did not touch quite, but they came close, and she was aware of that too. "Gilbert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and she felt him notice it. "Why do you come here?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Then he looked at her directly and without performance and said, "Because I want to." She held his gaze. The fire in the stove made a small sound. Outside, the October wind moved through the grass. "All right," she said. And then she smiled, which she had not done very often in his presence yet, and it changed her face in a way that he had apparently not been prepared for, because something in his expression shifted like the Kansas sky shifts when the weather comes deep and wide and sudden. "All right," he said, and smiled back. The letter went to the Wichita lawyer, whose name was Mr. James Alcott, the following week, along with Gilbert's notes. Alcott wrote back within 10 days. He was efficient. She liked that, and confirmed that the water rights registration was solid and that Cross would have no legal basis for a challenge, particularly given the original filing date. He offered to put this in a formal letter that could be presented should Cross make further inquiries, for a modest fee. She wrote back and engaged him. The formal letter arrived at the end of October, and she delivered a copy of it to Cross's operation via the Caldwell Postal Service, with a brief note of her own that was courteous, precise, and left no room for ambiguity. She did not hear from Cross again, except for a single expression of bad temper via an associate, which she did not bother to respond to. The land was hers, all of it, including the water. She put the correspondence in a box under the bed beside the deed and Thomas's letters, and she went out and walked the perimeter of her property in the November wind with Clara bundled against her chest, and she said out loud, because there was no one to hear her except the grass and the sky, "This is ours, Tom. We did it." She cried a little then, the way she cried, quickly and without lingering, and then she wiped her face and went home to start supper. November came in cold. The first frost arrived early, coating the grass white in the mornings and making the creek mornings spectacularly beautiful, all silver and pale blue. Ida had insulated the walls as best she could with additional boards and the dried grass that was in abundance, and the iron stove with its properly set flue pipe put out a solid heat that made the small house warm and close and good. Gilbert Ford came on a Saturday in early November with a cord of wood, split and stacked in the wagon, which he unloaded and piled against the west wall of the house before she had fully formulated an argument about whether she needed it. She stood in the doorway and watched him work and found that the argument was not forming with its usual energy. "You'll go through more than you think," he said, which was practical and accurate. "The winds off the prairie in January make even a solid stove work hard." "I know," she said. "I was going to cut more in December." "You can still cut more in December," he said. "This is extra." She brought him coffee when he was done, and they sat on the wooden bench she had put outside the front door. She was determined to sit outside in all reasonable weather, because she had decided early on that the sky was one of the compensations of Kansas, and she was not going to spend it all indoors, and they talked. They talked about a great many things that November, on various occasions. He told her about Missouri. He had grown up in a small town near the Missouri River, one of 4 brothers, the only one who had gone west. His father had been a blacksmith and his mother a schoolteacher, and from his mother he had gotten the habit of reading, and from his father the habit of making things work with his hands, and he considered himself fortunate in having gotten both. She told him about Georgia, where she had been born and raised, and about the particular kind of beauty and injustice of the South, and about the way she had left at 19 with a determination to go somewhere that she could make her own choices, which had led her to St. Louis, which had led her to Thomas, which had led her here. She told him about growing up as a black woman in the South in a time when the law and the culture had only recently and incompletely shifted, and about the ways in which that had shaped her. The necessity of being twice as certain, twice as prepared, twice as documenting of everything, because she had learned early that the benefit of the doubt was not a thing that was automatically extended to her, and that preparation was the most practical response to that reality. She said all of this calmly and factually, and he listened without deflecting or discomfiting her by making it about his own reactions, and when she was done he said, "It makes sense to me. What you've been doing. The deed always in your pocket, the lawyer, all of it." "It's practical," she said. "It's more than practical," he said quietly. "It's necessary, and the fact that it's necessary is wrong. I want to say that clearly." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. He looked back at her, and there was something in the way he held her gaze, not pity, not performance, but simply a steady and genuine acknowledgement. That was worth more to her than most of the things people had said to her on the subject over the years. They sat in the November light and drank their coffee, and Clara, who had pulled herself to standing against the door frame in the past 2 weeks with the concentrated triumph of a child achieving something extraordinary, stood at Ida's knee and held on. And Gilbert Ford watched the baby and the woman and the afternoon light on the grass with an expression Ida would later think of as a man realizing something about himself that he had not fully understood before. He asked her to dinner at Mrs. Tate's hotel dining room in late November, which was the most formal establishment available in Caldwell for such purposes. He asked in the way she had come to expect from him, simply, directly, without excessive ceremony. "Would you have dinner with me next Friday? In town?" She looked at him. "As what?" she asked. She was not coy about it. "As someone I'd like to spend more time with," he said, "and in whatever way you're comfortable with." A man and a woman having dinner in Caldwell in 1878 carries implications, she said. "I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." "No," he said. "I'm not pretending anything. I'm asking you to dinner because I'd like to court you if you're agreeable to that. I'm saying it plainly because I don't have another way of saying things." He paused. "And I understand if it's too soon or if you're not interested. I'll drive home and come back next week to check on the fence line, same as I've been doing, and neither of us will have to be uncomfortable about it." She sat with that for a moment. The afternoon light was very low and very gold. Clara was pulling at the hem of her skirt and saying something insistent. "Friday," she said. "Yes." He nodded, and she saw the particular quality of that nod, the one that meant he was keeping something quiet that wanted to be louder. "I'll arrange with Mrs. Tate for 7 o'clock. He did, and they went. And it was the kind of dinner that does not need embellishment in the retelling, because the simple facts of it were embellishment enough. Good food in a warm room. Two people who had established an easy honesty with each other, finding that the formality of the occasion gave them permission to say things they had been approaching obliquely. He told her he had not felt this ease with anyone in a very long time. She told him that she had not been looking for this and was no longer sorry that she had found it. Mrs. Tate, who had arranged for a neighboring woman to watch Clara for the evening and who watched the dinner from a tactful distance, later told her husband that she had not seen anything that cheerful in her dining room since the spring. December was cold and bright and full of things Ida had not expected. She had not expected the beauty of the frozen creek in the mornings, the way ice formed along the edges, and the water moved dark and clear in the center, the whole thing catching the low winter sun at angles that made it look like something out of a painting. She had not expected how quickly Clara would grow and change in the months since the stagecoach, how the solemn-faced baby who had ridden on her hip into Caldwell had become a person who pulled herself upright and crowed with delight at birds and reached for everything within reach, and had developed a particular and focused affection for Gilbert Ford that expressed itself in the way she turned toward him whenever he was in the room. She had not expected Gilbert Ford. That was the chief and most consequential unexpected thing. He came to the property twice a week now, and she came to his ranch on Sundays. She had seen the blue light on the water finally, and found it was exactly as he had described, and had told him so, and seen the pleasure in his face when she said it. The ranch was a working operation, well run and evident of thought in every detail, and she found herself asking questions about how it worked with the same focused interest she brought to everything. He answered every question fully, and without the diminishing explanations some men offered when they thought a woman was asking to be polite rather than to learn. She was learning. She had begun to think about what the next phase of the Wells property could be, not just a grazing lease, which was income but was someone else's cattle on her land, but something more genuinely hers. Perhaps a smaller herd. A dozen head, carefully managed. It was not impossible. It was not even implausible with the right knowledge and the right support. On a Sunday afternoon in mid-December, they were sitting at the table in her house with the stove going and Clara asleep on the bed in the corner, and they had been talking about cattle for an hour, and the conversation had come to a natural rest, and Gilbert was looking at her in the way that had become familiar, steady and open and warmer than the light, and she said, "You're going to say something." "I was thinking about something," he said. "Go ahead." He turned his coffee cup. "I've been thinking about what we're doing," he said. "I've been thinking about it carefully because I don't want to make an offer that's presumptuous or that doesn't account for what you've built here or what you're building. I know you didn't come to Caldwell for a man. I know what you came for, and I have considerable respect for what you've done since you got here." She watched him. He was choosing his words with the same deliberateness he applied to everything, and she waited. "I would like to ask you to consider a future with me," he said. "Not right now, not immediately, unless you want that, but as a direction, as what we're headed toward, if that's something you want to head toward." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to give up the land or to become part of my ranch or to stop being exactly who you are. I'm asking if you'd like to build something with me that has room for both of us in it." The fire in the stove made its small, steady sound. Outside, the December wind moved across the prairie. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Thomas, about the grief that was real and permanent and would always be there, like a stone at the bottom of a river, present and smoothed by time but not gone. She thought about what it meant to love someone after loss, whether it was a betrayal or a continuation or simply what life did when you let it. She thought about Clara, who was growing up with the memory of a father she would not remember, and deserved a life that was full and warm and real. She thought about Gilbert Ford, who had held a door for a strange woman with a baby on her hip and fire in her eyes, and had not made a performance of it, who had fixed a cabinet door and stacked firewood and written legal notes by lamplight, and looked at her the whole time like she was the most interesting landscape he had ever seen. "I want that," she said. He let out a breath he had been holding, she thought, since September. "Good," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm, and he smiled in return. And across the room Clara stirred in her sleep and sighed, and the stove kept burning, and outside the Kansas winter lay flat and bright and enormous all the way to the horizon. They were married in February of 1879, in the front room of the Blue Creek Ranch house, in a ceremony performed by the circuit judge who came through Caldwell on his quarterly round, and was a sensible and humorous man who had married more people in parlors and fields, and once memorably on a flatboat, than he had in courtrooms. The witnesses were Pete Dawes, who was sentimental and tried to hide it with excessive practical commentary, and Mrs. Florence Tate, who did not try to hide it at all and dabbed at her eyes without the slightest self-consciousness. Ida wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had chosen at Greaves' store, a deep blue that had made Aldous Greaves say, without apparent realizing he was saying it out loud, "That's a good color for a wedding," and then turned slightly pink. Clara sat in Mrs. Tate's arms during the ceremony and watched the proceedings with her characteristic solemn attention, and at the moment the judge said the final words and Gilbert put the ring on Ida's finger, a plain gold band that he had ordered from a jewelry dealer in Wichita, and that fit exactly right. Clara said something loud and definitive in her pre-language, and everyone laughed, and it was the best possible response. Afterward there was a meal. Mrs. Tate had organized a small gathering at the hotel dining room, because that was what Mrs. Tate did with events. She organized them into things worth remembering, and there were about a dozen people, neighbors and the ranch hands and a few of the town's more respectable citizens, and there was food and warmth and the particular pleasure of a celebration that is genuinely earned. Gilbert said at the table with his hand over hers, "I want to say something." "Go ahead," she said, which was what she always said. "I want to say that I know what you built," he said, "before this. And I want you to know that what we're building now doesn't erase it. It adds to it." He said it quietly because it was not for the room, it was for her. "Your land is your land. We build on top of that, not instead of it." She looked at him with the fire still in her eyes, but something warmer underneath it now, like a hearth fire rather than a forge fire, still strong, still capable of heat, but purposeful and homemaking in a way that a forge fire is not. "I know," she said. "I wouldn't have married you if you thought otherwise." He squeezed her hand. Pete Dawes said something across the table about fence repairs that needed doing in the spring, and everyone laughed at his timing, and the party went on. Spring came to Blue Creek with the particular extravagance of Kansas springs, sudden and excessive, as though the winter had been saving everything up. The grass came in green and deep, and the creek ran full and clear with snowmelt from the north, and the blue light on the water in the mornings was everything Gilbert had described and more. Ida stood at the ranch house door in the early light with coffee in her hands, more mornings than she could count, and watched the light move across the water and the grass and the long flat sky, and thought that she had not known, when she stepped off the stagecoach with a baby on her hip and a deed in her pocket and her chin squared against everything the town might throw at her, that she was also heading toward this light and this land and this man. She had kept her 40 acres. They had decided together, and it had been a real decision, a conversation at the table over several evenings, that the Wells property would be maintained as a working parcel under her name. The grazing lease with Elias Purcell ran through the spring, and then they restructured it as a joint arrangement, with Blue Creek running a small herd on the South Fork bottomland under a cooperative agreement that made financial sense for both operations, and meant that the creek water rights remained formally in Ida's name. It was, Gilbert told her without the slightest indication that he found this anything other than entirely correct, the best arrangement for the long term. She agreed. She had also, over the winter, begun writing more formally about land management and water rights. She had a clear and precise way with language that Gilbert said was unusual and valuable, and a lawyer in Wichita had expressed interest in consulting with her about the water rights documentation on several frontier cases he was managing. It was not a formal employment. Exactly nothing so organized existed in 1879 in Caldwell, but it was a thing she was doing with her mind and her knowledge, and she found it as satisfying as anything she had done. Clara turned 1 year old in November, and turned 14 months in the spring of Ida and Gilbert's first year at Blue Creek, and was walking by then with the determined and slightly sideways gait of a toddler who has recently discovered that locomotion is the greatest invention, and intends to use it continuously. She had words now, not many but purposeful ones. "Mama" was first, which Ida received with a fullness of feeling she had not been ready for. "Papa" came in February, applied to Gilbert, and Gilbert, who was not a man given to displays of emotion, had to set down the coffee he was holding and look out the window for a moment before he could respond to it. He looked at Ida over the top of Clara's head with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. "Papa," Clara said again, to be certain she had been heard. "Yes," Gilbert said when he could. "Yes." Ida reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a while. In the spring of 1880, they broke new ground on the Blue Creek property, an expansion of the kitchen garden and a second barn, larger than the first, to house the increased herd. Gilbert's operation had grown steadily, and he had 2 additional hands now, making it 6, and the work was constant and satisfying and sometimes grueling in the way of all work that matters. Ida was a part of all of it in the practical ways available to her, and in some ways that were specifically hers. She had taken over the bookkeeping for both properties with a thoroughness that made the bank manager in Caldwell, a careful man named Mr. Booth, expressed to Gilbert, with genuine professional admiration, that she ran the clearest accounts he had seen from a ranching operation in years. Gilbert had passed this on to Ida verbatim, because he thought she should hear it verbatim, without his commentary or framing. She had received it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been doing something excellently and is not surprised to have it recognized, but is pleased nevertheless. In the late summer of 1880, she told Gilbert that she was expecting again. She told him in the morning, before the hands were up, standing in the kitchen of the ranch house with the early light just beginning at the window. She said it simply, the way she said most things, with her eyes on his face to see his first unguarded response. His first unguarded response was to set down the boot he was holding, walk to her, and hold her face in both his large weathered hands with a gentleness that was its own kind of eloquence, and look at her for a moment as though she were the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. "Are you well?" he said, first, before everything else. She loved him for that. She had been loving him for nearly 2 years by then, in the accumulated practical and private and warm ways that love builds in the daily life of two people who have chosen each other truly. But that question, first and immediate about her, added a layer she had not known was still possible. "I'm well," she said. "I am very well." He kissed her then, in the kitchen in the early light, with the sound of the creek coming through the open window and the prairie day beginning to color outside, and she put her hands against his chest and felt the steady beat of him there, solid and real and hers. Their son was born in March of 1881, on a night when the winter was trying one last argument against the spring, and the wind was loud against the house. The doctor from Caldwell, a competent young man named Dr. Elliott Vance, who had come west 2 years ago with a medical degree from Cincinnati, and a genuine passion for frontier medicine, delivered him with the efficient calm of someone who was good at his work, and Mrs. Florence Tate was there, because she had been there for everything and would not have been elsewhere for any reason, and Gilbert was just outside the bedroom door the whole time in a state of barely suppressed anxiety that Pete Dawes, who was keeping him company, later described as the most productive anxiety he had ever seen, because Gilbert had repaired 2 chair rungs and a window latch while it was happening. The baby announced himself loudly and immediately, and Ida held him against her chest and looked at his face, which was round and dark-eyed and already, she thought, going to be the face of someone who had opinions, and felt the full weight and completeness of the word family settle around her like something that had been looking for its proper place for a long time and had found it. Gilbert came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the careful gravity of a large man handling something precious, and looked at him for a long time. "Thomas," Ida said, and then when she saw his face, "Thomas Gilbert Ford, if that's agreeable to you." Gilbert looked up. She saw the thing in his eyes that she could not have named in the beginning but could name now. It was love, specific and full and adult, the kind that has been tested by real weather and knows its own depth. "It is," he said. "It is more than agreeable." Clara, who had been asleep in her room and had been woken by the baby's announcement and had come to the bedroom door and was standing there in her nightgown with her cloth doll worn now with 2 years of handling, but intact, looked at the baby in her father's arms and said in her clear, frank, 2-year-old voice, loud, "Yes," Ida agreed. "He's going to be loud. I think we can manage that." Clara considered this and accepted it with a nod of a seriousness that made Mrs. Florence Tate, in the corner, produce her handkerchief for the second time. Thomas Wells Ford grew in the way of Kansas Springs, fast and extravagant and more than you had bargained for in the best possible way. By 6 months he was regarding his sister with the attentive fascination of someone studying a person they intend to learn everything from, and Clara, for her part, had accepted her role as the person he was going to learn from with the matter-of-fact competence she applied to most things she received from her mother. The summer of 1881 was a good one. The herd was healthy, the grass was full, and the creek ran clean. Ida's consultative work on water rights documentation had expanded. She had been asked, through Mr. Alcott in Wichita, to assist with documentation for 3 separate frontier cases, which constituted a small but real income of her own, and more importantly, a field in which she was genuinely expert in a way that people now sought out rather than stumbled upon. She was 29 years old, and if she was not exactly as she had imagined herself at 29, grief did not allow for exactly as imagined, and nor did the West. She was something better, honest and rooted and abundantly alive. On a late August evening, she and Gilbert sat on the bench outside the ranch house, the one he had built, and she had claimed as her particular spot for watching the sky, and the children were inside with the hired woman, Mrs. Carroll, who came 3 days a week, and the sky was doing what the Kansas sky did in the late summer evenings, turning colors you had no names for over distances you could not measure. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Go ahead," he said, which was what he always said, because they had learned each other's patterns the way you learn the land by moving across it slowly and with attention. "I was thinking about the day I arrived," she said. "The stagecoach. The door of Greaves' store." He looked at her. The light was doing something remarkable with the color of the sky behind her, and she had Clara's solemn look in that moment, and also something that was entirely and only herself. "I was so angry," she said. "Not at you specifically, at everything, at Thomas for dying, at the world for being arranged the way it was, at the fact that a woman with a baby and a deed still had to walk into every room ready for a fight." She paused. "And then you stepped aside and held the door, and it was such a small thing, but it was the right small thing at exactly the right moment." He was quiet for a moment. The light moved. "I remember thinking," he said, "that you looked like someone who was used to fighting for the door." "I was," she said. "And I remember thinking," he said, "that you shouldn't have to." She looked at him. There was still fire in her eyes. There would always be fire in her eyes. It was as fundamental to her as her name, but it was the hearth fire now, purposeful and warm and permanent, the kind of fire you build a home around. "No," she said, "I shouldn't have." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they sat like that in the late August light with the grass and the sky and the sound of the creek, and the children's voices drifting out through the ranch house window, and Blue Creek reflecting the last of the day back at the sky in long, bright lines of water. They built more in the years that followed. The ranch grew, not recklessly but steadily, the way of things managed by people who understood what they were doing. Ida's 40 acres continued under her name, properly registered and properly maintained, a matter of pride and principle both. The first thing that had been hers in Kansas, the anchor of everything that came after, and she walked its perimeter once a month in every season with whatever child was old enough to walk it with her, telling them what it had taken to claim it and why that mattered. Clara Ford grew into a girl who read everything she could find and had opinions about most of it, which her parents received with the kind of genuine delight that comes from having a child who is undeniably their own in the best ways. She would have her father's steadiness and her mother's fire, and the combination was going to require a very large world, which was exactly the kind of world Ida intended to help build around her. Thomas grew, and was as loud as promised, and as warm and affectionate as his father, and had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and a laugh that you could hear from 2 fields over, which the ranch hands considered a fine feature in the boss's son. In the spring of 1883, a 3rd child arrived, a girl they named Rose after no one in particular, but because the spring that year was extravagant with wildflowers, and it seemed appropriate, and Blue Creek expanded its east section to accommodate the growing need, and Ida wrote a formal paper on frontier water rights that Mr. Alcott submitted to a legal journal in Kansas City, and it was published with her name on it, which caused a brief sensation in the particular small world of frontier land law, and gave her a satisfaction that she kept private, but that Gilbert could see in her face, and did not say anything about except to bring her a second cup of coffee on the morning the copy arrived, with his hand briefly on her shoulder. The children grew up knowing the land as intimately as they knew each other. They knew the creek and the grass and the particular quality of the morning light, and they knew their mother's history and their father's history, and the history of the 40 acres on the South Fork that had been the beginning of everything. And they grew up knowing that a woman with fire in her eyes and a baby on her hip and a deed in her pocket could walk into a town alone and build a life from the ground up. And that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is hold a door. Ida kept the deed. She kept it in the box under the bed with Thomas's letters and her marriage certificate, and the formal legal opinion from Mr. Alcott and the copy of the published paper. And once in a while she took it out and looked at it, the cramped official handwriting, and the county seal and her husband's name, and then her own name written over it in the recorder's ink. And she thought about the woman who had arrived on that stagecoach with everything she owned in a single trunk, and a baby on her hip, and the stubborn, ungovernable certainty that she would not spend her life being defeated by anything. That woman was still there, inside her, the way roots are still there in the ground even after the plant has grown enormous. The fire was still there, just as it had always been, and she would not have had it any other way, and neither would Gilbert, who had known from the first moment that the fire was not a problem to be managed, but a thing to be grateful for. He was still grateful. He told her so with regularity, and with the particular lack of performance that characterized everything he did, not on occasions or in large speeches, but on Tuesday mornings over the coffee, and on Sunday evenings on the bench in the late light, and in the small daily choices that add up over years to a life. Still stepping aside, still holding the door, not because she could not open it herself, but because he wanted to be the person at her side when she walked through it. In 1885, 7 years after a stagecoach deposited a woman and a baby on the main street of Caldwell in the July heat, the Ford Ranch celebrated its 15th year as a working cattle operation with a gathering that included most of the neighboring ranchers. The hands past and present, Mrs. Florence Tate, still sharp-eyed and still prone to handkerchief deployment at significant moments, Pete Dawes, who was now married and had 2 children of his own, and still talked about fence repairs at inopportune moments, and a dozen others who had been part of the life, and the land and the years. There was a table long enough for all of them set up outside, because the evening was warm and the sky was doing the particular thing it did in June, going gold and rose and deep violet all the way across the horizon, and the creek was audible and the grass was deep, and the children ran between the tables in the low light with the specific freedom of children who know their own ground intimately. Ida stood at the edge of it all and watched, with Gilbert beside her, his shoulder against hers, and Clara chasing Thomas through the grass, and Rose sitting in Pete Dawes' wife's lap with a very serious expression, and the light on the water and the sound of all of it, and she thought about the stagecoach and the dust and the $42 and the fire in her chest that had never gone out. She had been so certain that first day, so absolutely, frighteningly certain that she would not be defeated, and she hadn't been. And it had been hard, and it had been worth every ounce of the hardness, and she stood in the late June light of 1885 with her husband's arm warm around her shoulders and her children's voices in the air and the land running in every direction under an enormous sky, and she was so full of it all that she almost couldn't contain it. "All right," Gilbert said quietly just for her. She turned to look at him. The fire in her eyes was everything it had always been, clear and steady and bright, undimmed by 7 years of prairie weather and marriage and children, and all the 1,000 practical things that constitute a life. Maybe brighter, even. The kind of fire that feeds on good wood and good air and burns long and clean. "All right," she said, and she smiled and he smiled back, and it was the same smile as the December kitchen in 1878, only 7 years deeper and 7 years richer and 7 years more completely and permanently their own. Clara called from the grass, "Mama, Thomas says I can't catch him, but I can. Tell him I can. She can, Ida called back without looking away from Gilbert. She definitely can, Gilbert confirmed. Thomas's outraged voice carried across the evening. Papa! She can, Gilbert said again, with the calm certainty of a man who knows his daughter. Ida laughed and he laughed, and the evening opened around them like the sky opened in the mornings over Blue Creek, wide and blue and full of every kind of light, the kind of light that makes even a long-traveled woman stop and look and think. Yes, this is the place. This, exactly and precisely, is the place I was heading toward all along. The creek ran, and the grass grew, and the light moved across the land the way it always had and always would, and Ida Wells Ford stood in the middle of it all with the fire still burning and the roots going deep. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.